Watch me explode. When I started this set, I never could have imagined how drastically my perspective on these games would change. I thought for sure I would line up with most of the popular opinions, but my goal here really isn't to be an echo chamber. There are plenty of those already. My goal is to relay my experience and open up the broader conversations about the things that I take notice of. So today, we're going to take a look at Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 on the PS2 and the PS1. I'm covering both versions because they're entirely different games, and both of them came out on mainstream home consoles. Let's get started. We'll do the PS2 version first, just because it's easier to talk about. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, developed by Neversoft in 2002, is the beginning of a completely different era of Tony Hawk games. Development began not long after the release of Pro Skater 3, but things probably started to hit their peak following the runoff success. Prior to 2016, Pro Skater 3 was one of the top 100 best-selling games of all time across all platforms. It held that high position for well over a decade. Pro Skater 4 has a lot to live up to, even in just that first year, and for the sake of survival, it had to be better. If you didn't know, the biggest reason a game series gets cancelled is because the sales fall below expectations. That doesn't mean a game isn't successful. It can sell just as many copies as the previous game and still fall below expectations. Publishers expect sequels to make more money than before. There's an unrealistic thought among executives that games need to outsell their predecessors every single time because they make the really stupid decision to increase the production budget with every single success. The video game industry is really volatile like that. As more money is made, more money is spent. But if recent years have taught us anything, it's that more money does not equate to good games. You can have all of the budget on Earth and still shit out the biggest stinker. So the problem for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 beating the unpredicted success was the stability of increasing sales suddenly looking exponentially less stable. On top of having to break a ridiculous sales record, Neversoft also had to win over the critics. The game needed to get equal, if not better, reception just to meet the sales minimum, and they couldn't do that just by releasing the exact same game again. Despite the crazy odds, Pro Skater 4 was a tremendous success. Some fans hail it as the best game in the series. The career mode here is a huge step away from the previous games. The player still completes goals in one map to move on to the next, but this time it's a lot different. Instead of having 2 minutes to complete as many goals as possible, this is the first game in the series to feature career free skate. You have an unlimited amount of time to screw around. To start a goal, you can either walk up to an NPC and talk to them, or just start a goal from the pause menu. This was the first game in the series to feature NPC dialogue, and it gives the whole thing a lot more life and personality. Aside from the goals, Pro Skater 4 brings back the best idea from Pro Skater 2. Completing goals will award you with cash that you can then use to buy decks, levels, and other things. Dotted around each map are these cash pickups that you can grab, and those are super helpful if you're just a few bucks shy for that skate movie you need. I love this system in Pro Skater 2, but it feels better here. Cash pickups are divided between spots you're guaranteed to use and spots you would probably never use. The ones that are really out of the way can lead you to some awesome objects that you'll never touch in the goals. They've been given more purpose. Even better is that it isn't tied to stats. Instead, stats are awarded for finishing most goals, and I like having multiple systems for everything. It feels much more organized. I don't want to stick on the gameplay for too long because there's a lot of stuff we've already seen before. Ollie with the no comply and boneless, flip tricks, grab tricks, grinds, manuals, wall rides, and wallies, and everything else. All of it makes a complete return, and it feels great. There's a big list of new shit, so I'll try to be timely about this. We have double tap flips now, and double grabs. Those existed before in Pro Skater 3, but here they've been given a massive upgrade. Every trick has a double variant, which means more points. This was the first game in the series to have the level out mechanic. If you accidentally fly off of a ramp, you can now even out in air to save your combo chain. The biggest new mechanic is extensions. You can now perform a variety of flatland tricks, and you can change your grind or lip tricks suddenly. This is huge. It adds a lot of depth to what you can already do with everything. The next big inclusion is skitching. You can now hold on to cars and use them to reach really high speeds. This is a really helpful inclusion, but it doesn't get as much spotlight here as it should outside of a couple of goals. The last major addition is spine transfer. You can now spine between 2 ramps, and that helps to keep chains going for much longer. There are other small additions too, like being able to quick turn with a power slide, or the wall plant, which is just a boneless off of a wall. In this game, it's called the wall plant, but that was changed in later games. All of the new mechanics feel great, and none of it ever feels unnecessary. They managed to widen the scope of what you can do without overwhelming the game with new mechanics. It's damn near perfect, but it suffers from Pro Skater 2 syndrome. Later games did a lot of ideas better than this. That doesn't mean it isn't good, that just means it was done better later. Now that I've hit on the normal stuff, let me teach you a little bit of tech that you might not know. You can spin flatland tricks by tapping the left or the right trigger. If you spin a flatland trick right as you start a wall ride, you'll do a wall spin. It works pretty consistently, but it can be tricky to nail if you aren't used to it. You can do this exact same thing against rails to perform a rail spin. If you spin a flatland trick before exiting a ramp or getting air, you'll do a hyperspin. Hyperspins don't count the extra spin animations as full extra spins, but they look pretty cool. The map design in this game is top tier. Compared to the previous games, they are gargantuan in size. The attention to detail in all of them is amazing, and pretty much every object is skatable. When I think of perfectly designed maps in games, I think of Alcatraz. It does so many good things. The layout is a downhill map, but in reverse. You start at the bottom of the island, and in front of you are a ton of chainable pieces that lead you into the rest of the level. There are practically no empty spaces, and the few lesser populated areas are compact enough to be comfortable. The outer ring is similar to Venice in that there's a boundary everywhere, but the reason it works here and not there is because the rest of the map has a ton of stuff. Alcatraz doesn't force you to make use of that outer ring like Venice does. It provides the opportunity to make use of it, and there are plenty of exits to take your line somewhere else so that you don't risk falling out too often. On top of that, this map has some of the earliest giant air because it has the very first giant spine transfers. There are so many different ways you can approach every part of it. As far as all of the other maps go, they're all really good. I mentioned in my Matt Hoffman's Pro BMX video that Chicago made an appearance in this game, and it isn't just an empty bonus level. It has cash pickups, goals, and it costs a lot of money to open. It would also feel really good if it were scaled down a little bit. I stand by my statement that Hoffman Warehouse or Las Vegas would have been better, but Chicago's still always good. The soundtrack here is really good too. It keeps up the theme that Pro Skater 3 set out to achieve. Bigger, more chaos, and a lot more familiar. The headline track, TNT, plays so often that you'll never get it out of your head after one playthrough. Overall, it's massive. The actual size of the soundtrack is 3 times bigger than any of the previous games, and because it's so many large, recognizable faces, it's a lot easier to remember. Finally, the supply of skateboarding footage makes a full swing return. Skate movies can now be bought with cash, and they're just as great as they've always been. That said, I've been made totally biased by the quality of Pro BMX 2 and Pro Surfer. The films in those are S tier. With everything said, I think I'll give Pro Skater 4 on the PS2 a rating of 9 out of 10. This game is damn near perfect. It does everything right and then more. The only reason I don't think it's a 10 out of 10 is because the series went on to raise the bar again. I'm not basing these reviews on what was new when this game came out. I'm rating these games based on my experience right here and right now, and I'm doing that to organize how playable I think these games are today. Pro Skater 4 is awesome, a must play if you never have. The variety of shit to do is enormous, and you could easily waste hours going through all of the goals to unlock the pro goals. But now that I'm done with it, I would still rather play one of the later games. Pro Skater 4 is a special place in my heart, but I think I can comfortably leave it there. Now let's talk about that PS1 port. In what was the ultimate act of Activision trolling ever, the PS1 port of Pro Skater 4 was released in the UK 2 weeks before the actual game came out. Just so we're clear, it was never intended to be the main port at all. But Activision, being the money milker they really are, wanted to yoink some dollars from the last few kids who were stuck on their PS1. The fact that this exists at all is crazy, but this is a completely different game, and that makes it so much more interesting. This port is the brainchild of Vicarious Visions, so it should at least be playable. The career mode here is similar to the regular Pro Skater 4. You can free skate around in career mode and start goals at your leisure. The actual NPCs are gone, and so is the voice acting. Instead, you have to talk to these goal markers that just tell you what to do. Both games have quite a few of the familiar goals, like score and letters, but this port has a completely unique set of variety goals to the PS2 port. Almost every goal has an AM, Pro, and Extreme version, so we aren't strapped for things to do. My one concern with this was that it would get repetitive pretty fast, but honestly, it doesn't feel any different than any other game in the series. Most of the goals are just filler and fluff to teach you how to play the game. One major difference between this and the PS2 is that the cash pickups are gone. Cash as a system is completely gone. Everything is now spread out in the form of collectibles. One of my favorite ideas from Pro BMX 2 makes a return here. Instead of just having the entire soundtrack already unlocked, you have to pick up these CDs in each map. You'll also be grabbing decks, stat points, and the hidden tape. Stat points work twofold here. There are stat points that you can pick up out in the wild, but you'll also be awarded stat points for completing specific goals. I kind of like that hybrid system. I mean, it's literally padding, but it doesn't feel like it hurts anything. You'll be randomly picking up stat points doing goals anyway. I like the cash system in the PS2 version, but I don't think this version is big enough to justify that. Contests make a return, but they aren't the same as before. Instead of a dedicated map for contests, each level now has a contest that lets you make use of the entire map. I really like this idea. The contests in the PS2 port of this game, as well as the later Tony Hawk games, always put a boundary around the player. They limit the contest space to what is usually a very tiny chunk, making them often feel boring or restrictive. I like being able to make full use of the map. The contests here are an opportunity to take everything you've learned about a map and put it to work in a high score run. It's much more encouraging. Let's talk about the gameplay. This game is Pro Skater 2. No, seriously. Pro Skater 4 on the PS1 is a pretty faithful remake of the PS2 port, and it uses the Pro Skater 2 engine because, well, I don't know. Somebody at the decision-making level decided that Pro Skater 2 was better than 3, and here we are. There are a considerable number of new things added to the Pro Skater 2 formula here, so it isn't an identical copy. First is level out, which works sometimes, but often sends you flying too far away from the rail to catch yourself. It's misaligned enough to be pretty annoying. Next inclusion is grind and lip extensions. Unlike the PS2 port where you tap 2 face buttons to change your grind or lip trick, here you just tap the D-pad one way and press triangle. It works, but there's a lot less variety to it than the PS2 version. Next we've got revert to manual. This is by far the worst part of this game. It doesn't even actually work most of the time. The window to hit a revert is incredibly tight, and even when you hit that window, sometimes it just won't happen. When it fails, the game actually thinks it does happen. So you can do a combo reset a couple of times after a timer runs out just by tapping R2 at the wrong millisecond. It's a good attempt, but it's literally broken. Another thing that's completely broken is double and triple flips. Like the PS2 port, double tapping a face button will do a double tap variant of a trick, but unlike the PS2 port, this game only uses that logic for flips. There are no double tap grabs. To make it even worse, the double and triple inputs barely ever register, meaning simple goals like triple flip the half pipe gap are much harder than they should be. You have to spam the button within an unrealistically tiny window, and even then, it still doesn't register most of the time. That's one of the biggest problems with this port overall. The Pro Skater 2 stuff that was already there works perfectly fine. There's even a bit more lenience to the whole thing. But every single one of the new Pro Skater 4 mechanics is just outright broken. It feels unfinished. Like Vicarious had all of these systems developed and ready, but didn't get any time to polish the game at all, which couldn't possibly be true. I mean, this game got a long development. Given the fact that it's a last-gen port of a PS2 game, it kind of makes sense. But just being old hardware is no excuse to release a broken game. Some kid somewhere spent money on this. Some kid somewhere was hyped for this. I can't imagine how disappointing it must have been. Then again, I imagine there are probably a few people out there who liked it because they weren't expecting a whole lot. The map designs in this game are one of the more interesting parts of the whole experience. Some of the maps from the PS2 port are missing, but most of them are still intact. There are also 2 entirely new levels exclusive to this port, and that's always nice. The actual maps themselves are modified and cut down versions of the PS2 port, but some of them have entirely new decisions and layouts. Maps like College and Alcatraz suffer from the removal of stuff. They're a lot less fun to play here. But maps like Kona, London, and San Francisco are actually entirely different versions with new design choices that work in their favor. Kona now has this sunset skybox, giving it a more psychedelic feeling, and the pieces are more concentrated. It has a lot of that empty space compressed down into a more stable object layout. London is now a night map with rain. San Francisco is now an entirely dock setting, but it's one of the more complex remakes, and the amount of skating variety is really good. Overall, I think the maps work. The designs fit the idea. They're demade enough to fit into a PS1 game, but not so destroyed that they feel lifeless or empty. This is probably my favorite part of the game. I'd love to play these variations of the maps in any other game, because I feel like there's a lot of untapped potential here. The visuals aren't bad either, considering this is a PS1 game. It's a give and take to make the whole thing work. In order to make the levels bigger, draw distance had to be cut down significantly. That means you'll constantly be looking at visual pop-in. Thankfully, there isn't a lot of polygon wobble or anything. As far as PS1 games go, this is one of the better looking ones, so I'll gladly take more objects for less draw distance, honestly. The last thing I want to talk about is the soundtrack. 19 songs from the PS2 soundtrack have been cut out, and the few remaining songs have been censored. I hate that this version is cut down, but there are a couple of things that make it forgivable. First, this is a PS1 game, and PS1 CD-ROMs really didn't have a lot of capacity. Second, this game includes pretty much all of the skateboarding footage, and it isn't compressed to shit, so I don't mind the compromise that much. That said, I think the song collectibles would have been better in the PS2 port because there are so many more songs. At the end of everything, I can confidently give Pro Skater 4 on the PS1 a rating of 4 out of 10. It's a Tony Hawk game. Some of it works. It's a faithful enough remake, but every single new mechanic addition is broken in some way, and that's pretty unforgivable. This game is tedious and frustrating more than it is fun. The game confirmed one very important thing for me. The hatred for Pro Skater 5 is absolute nonsense. The consistent complaint I heard about that game was just how unplayably broken it was, which turned out to not be true for my own personal single-player experience. I barely saw any bugs in that game, and I never had inputs drop as much as I have here. This game is actually broken and outright unplayable sometimes. The majority of late game combo challenges are brutally difficult because chaining combos just doesn't work most of the time. That same problem moves over to contests, where late game contests will ask you to get point score minimums that you can't even do without using the broken shit. There are so many goals and moments in this game that made me want to take a bite out of my controller, and I'm really glad to be done with it. I don't recommend playing this to anybody unless you're really curious about the 2 extra maps and the differences in the level design. I have to warn you, the game is an actual slog, and getting those maps is not easy. You need to complete more than half of the enormous list of goals just to get all of them. It isn't worth it. Now that I'm done with all of that, I can finally move on from Pro Skater and into the rest of the Tony Hawk series. But before I do that, I keep getting requests to play aggressive inline, so I'll go ahead and get that out of the way. I'm not only going to play aggressive inline though. If you're an American, then my next video will have a really interesting surprise for you. A game you've likely never heard of before. Until then, thank you, and have a nice day.